The stench of stale cigarettes and bottom-shelf whiskey invaded my nostrils. That suffocating combination that had long ago embedded itself into every fiber of our home, until the memory of fresh air became nothing more than a distant dream. 10 o'clock on a Thursday night found me at the kitchen sink, my hands buried deep in murky dishwater that had gone cold, while my father's voice erupted from the living room with the terrifying crescendo of an approaching hurricane. "You little liar, I told you what happens to liars in this house." The crack of leather meeting flesh split the air. Once, the sound reverberated through my bones. Twice, my body went rigid. 3 times. Then came that sound, that heartbreaking whimper that only a 7-year-old child makes when he's learned through brutal experience that crying will only make the monster angrier. The plate slipped from my numb fingers, clattering against the others in the sink, but miraculously not shattering. My feet were moving before my brain could catch up, propelling me forward on pure maternal instinct. The hallway seemed to stretch impossibly long, each frantic step taking an eternity, while those sickening sounds continued to echo from the living room. Time distorted seconds feeling like hours as my heart hammered against my ribs. When I finally reached the doorway, the scene before me stopped my breath. Ethan was curled into himself on the hardwood floor, his tiny hands pressed desperately against his face, his small shoulders trembling violently with the monumental effort of staying silent. Looming over my baby like a nightmare, made flesh stood my father, that worn leather belt dangling from his clenched fist like a weapon, his face blazing crimson in that sickeningly familiar way that told me he'd been drinking steadily since we'd sat down for dinner hours ago. "What are you doing?" The words tore out of me before I could stop them. He turned slowly, and I watched his expression shift from rage to something colder, more calculated. He lied to me. In this house, liars get corrected. I moved between them without thinking, my body acting on instinct, even though my mind knew better. "He's 7 years old. He's a child." My father's lips curved into something that might have been a smile if smiles weren't supposed to hold warmth. His breath hit me in a wave of alcohol and something rotten. "And you're the shame of this family. You should be thanking me for teaching the boy what you never learned." From the couch, my mother sat peeling an orange with methodical precision, her face as blank as a wall. She didn't look up when she spoke. She was worse at that age. The words felt like another slap. I gathered Ethan into my arms, his small body trembling against mine. "I hate you," I said, looking directly at my father. "I wish I'd never been born your daughter." He didn't answer with the words. Instead, he set the belt down on the coffee table with deliberate care and turned toward the garage door. "Stay right there," he said, and something in his tone made ice spread through my chest. "What is he doing?" I asked my mother, but she just looked at me with those empty eyes that had watched me suffer for 29 years. "If you can't shut that mouth of yours, he'll seal it like the garbage it spews." When my father came back, he was holding a tube of industrial adhesive, the kind used for construction for bonding things that should never come apart. I felt my breath catch. "No, please, I'm sorry, I'll be quiet." But he was already moving toward me, and when I tried to back away, his hand locked around my arm like a vice. Ethan screamed a sound so raw it seemed to tear the air itself. "Grandpa, please don't hurt her, please." I tried to fight, tried to turn my head away, but my father was stronger, and he'd done this dance before, knew exactly how to overpower someone who'd been trained since childhood not to fight back. The tube came up, and then there was cold gel against my lips, sticky and chemical smelling, and his hand pressed hard over my mouth, holding it closed. The world went dark at the edges. I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream. My nose worked desperately to pull in air while my mouth sealed shut, the adhesive hardening fast burning my skin. Ethan's cries became distant underwater sounds. My father's face hovered above mine, watching with clinical interest as I struggled. After what felt like hours, but was probably seconds, he let go. I collapsed to my knees, gasping through my nose, in short, panicked bursts. My lips felt like they were on fire, glued together with a thick layer of hardened chemical. When I touched them with shaking fingers, I felt how completely shut they were. My mother's voice drifted over from the couch, still casual, still unconcerned. "You shouldn't have provoked him. He hates loud women." My father wiped his hands on a rag, studying his work. "Now she'll learn her lesson. Some mouths don't deserve to open." He switched off the living room light and walked away, leaving Ethan and me on the floor in darkness. My son crawled into my lap, his face wet with tears, and wrapped his arms around my neck. I held him as tightly as I could, feeling his heart hammer against my chest. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark with my boy in my arms, feeling the chemical burn on my lips, the suffocating pressure of being literally silenced. The pain wasn't just physical. It was the knowledge that my own parents had done this to me, that my mother had sat there peeling her orange while I was tortured, that my father had smiled while he sealed my mouth shut like I was an object to be fixed, not a human being. Ethan whimpered in his sleep, and I stroked his hair with one hand while the other touched the hardened glue on my mouth. In that moment, something inside me shifted, broke, reformed into something harder and sharper. I made myself a promise in the silence. I wouldn't scream anymore, not until I could make sure they never would again. Morning came gray and cold. I locked myself in the bathroom and worked at the adhesive with trembling fingers, peeling it away bit by bit. The skin underneath was raw and bleeding, torn where the glue had bonded too deep. Each piece that came off took a layer of me with it, leaving wounds that would scar. I stared at my reflection in the mirror, at the torn lips and the hollow eyes, and felt something settle in my chest like a stone. The woman looking back at me was a stranger, her mouth a ruin of split skin and dried blood, but her eyes held something new, something cold and calculating that hadn't been there before. I ran the water until it turned hot enough to steam the mirror, then soaked a washcloth and pressed it gently against my mouth. The pain was immediate and sharp, but I welcomed it. Pain meant I was still alive. Pain meant I could still feel something other than the numbness that had defined most of my life. As I carefully cleaned away the blood, I noticed my hands had stopped shaking. That was new too. I applied petroleum jelly to the worst of the tears, wincing as the greasy substance stung the raw flesh. Then I opened the medicine cabinet and found the concealer I'd bought months ago after my father had given me a black eye for forgetting to buy his specific brand of cigarettes. The makeup was thick and cakey, designed to hide bruises, and it took 3 layers before the damage looked somewhat normal. Not good, never good, but normal enough that a stranger wouldn't immediately call the police. When I finally emerged from the bathroom, 45 minutes had passed. I could hear the sounds of breakfast happening downstairs, the clink of silverware on plates, the low murmur of the morning news. My parents eating their eggs and toast like they hadn't destroyed another piece of their daughter the night before. Like this was just another Thursday morning in the Turner household. I descended the stairs slowly, each step measured and deliberate. My reflection in the hallway mirror caught my eye, and for a moment I didn't recognize myself. I looked pale, drawn. The concealer did its job on my mouth, but it couldn't hide the hollowness in my cheeks, or the dark circles under my eyes that spoke of years, not just one night of sleeplessness. When I entered the kitchen, my father was already seated at his usual spot at the head of the table, reading the financial section of the newspaper. He didn't look up. My mother stood at the stove flipping bacon with the same mechanical precision she applied to everything in her life. Neither of them acknowledged my presence, and for a moment I wondered if I'd become a ghost. If maybe I died on that living room floor and this was some kind of purgatory. But then my father spoke, his voice carrying that edge of satisfaction that made my stomach turn. "You're late. Breakfast should have been ready 20 minutes ago." I moved to the counter without responding, pulling eggs from the refrigerator and bread from the pantry. My mother finally glanced at me, her eyes skimming over my face, with the same indifference she might show a piece of furniture. Then she saw my mouth, the slight swelling the concealer couldn't quite hide, and something flickered across her features. Not quite guilt, not quite concern, maybe just a vague recognition that something had happened. Something that would be inconvenient if anyone outside the family noticed. "You should ice that," she said flatly, turning back to her bacon. "Before you go to the store, we can't have people asking questions." The casual cruelty of it, the implication that my injury was primarily a problem because of what the neighbors might think, hit me harder than any physical blow could have. This was my mother, the woman who was supposed to protect me, nurture me, love me. Instead, she was worried about gossip. I cracked eggs into a bowl and whisked them with more force than necessary, feeling the rage build hot and bright in my chest. But I didn't let it show on my face. I'd learned that lesson long ago. Show emotion and you give them power. Stay blank and you keep a piece of yourself they can't touch. When I set the plates down, my father glanced up with a smirk. It was the kind of smile a cat might give a mouse before delivering the killing blow. "Look at that, quiet as a mouse. Maybe she finally learned." I felt the words form before I could stop them rising up from that new hard place inside me. My voice came out steady, almost cheerful. I'll wear red lipstick tomorrow. The statement hung in the air like a challenge, though they were too self-absorbed to recognize it as such. My mother actually looked pleased, a genuine smile crossing her thin lips for the first time in months. See, you can be pretty when you keep that mouth shut. I've been telling you for years that you'd be so much more attractive if you just learned to be quiet. Women who talk too much never keep men interested. My father grunted in agreement, already turning back to his newspaper. About time she figured it out. Thought we'd have to glue her mouth shut permanently. They both laughed at that. Actually laughed. The sound echoed in the kitchen like broken glass, sharp and cutting, and I realized in that moment just how far gone they were. How completely they detached from any sense of normal human empathy. This wasn't just abuse. This was pathology. My parents weren't just cruel, they were fundamentally broken in a way that couldn't be fixed. I served them coffee, my hands steady, despite the storm raging inside me. I cleared their dishes when they were done. I wiped down the counters and loaded the dishwasher and played the role of the obedient daughter they'd spent 29 years trying to create through fear and violence. But inside, something had fundamentally changed. I wasn't planning revenge, not yet. I was simply observing, learning, understanding the full scope of what I was dealing with. After breakfast, my parents left for church. They went every Sunday, never missed a service, were pillars of the community. My father taught adult Sunday school. My mother organized the charity drives. To the outside world, they were model citizens, devoted Christians who embodied the values of faith and family. No one knew what happened behind the closed doors of our house. No one would believe it if I told them. As soon as their car pulled out of the driveway, I went upstairs. Not to my bedroom, but to the attic. The pull-down ladder creaked under my weight, and the air that hit my face when I climbed through the opening was thick with dust and heat. A single bulb hung from a wire in the center of the space, casting weak yellow light over decades of accumulated junk. I'd been up here before, of course. As a child, I'd hidden in the attic when my father's rages became too much to bear. I'd memorized every box, every forgotten piece of furniture, every shadow, but I'd never really looked at it all, never really understood what was stored up here. Now, with new eyes and a new purpose, I began to search. The first box I opened contained old photo albums. I flipped through pages of stiff black paper looking at pictures of my childhood that told a story completely different from the one I'd lived. There I was at 5, smiling for the camera, with my father's hand on my shoulder. At 8, wearing a dress I'd hated standing between my parents on Easter Sunday. At 12, holding a trophy from a spelling bee I'd been forced to enter because my mother wanted to brag to her friends. In every single photo, my smile looked wrong, too tight, too forced. The smile of a hostage, not a happy child. I set the albums aside and kept digging. Another box held my old school papers, report cards covered in straight A's, and teacher comments about what a pleasure I was to have in class. How quiet, how well behaved. How I never caused trouble. Reading those comments now, I could see what they really meant. I'd been so thoroughly beaten down, so completely terrorized at home, that I'd carried that fear with me everywhere. I'd been the perfect student because I was too afraid to be anything else. Then I found it. A water-stained cardboard box pushed far back under the eaves, forgotten and dusty. Inside was my college acceptance letter, the one from the university, 2 states away, that had offered me a full scholarship. I remembered the day it arrived, how I'd held that envelope with shaking hands, hope blooming bright and desperate in my chest. I'd thought this was my escape, my chance to finally be free. But my father had found the letter before I could hide it. He'd read it, his face turning redder with each line, and then he'd torn it to pieces right in front of me. "You think you're smart enough for college," he'd spat. "You think you're better than us. You're too stupid to survive on your own. You'd flunk out in a month and come crawling back here, and I'd be damned if I'm going to let you embarrass this family like that." I'd tried to explain about the scholarship, about how it wouldn't cost them anything, but he'd backhanded me so hard I'd seen stars. That was the night I'd learned that some dreams were dangerous, that hoping for more than what they allowed me was a punishable offense. Now, holding the torn pieces of that letter, I felt something crystallize inside me. I carefully gathered every fragment and placed them in an empty envelope. This was evidence, not for a court of law, but for the court of my own memory. Proof that I'd once had potential, that I'd been more than the shell of a person they'd tried to reduce me to. I found other things in that box too. My childhood diary filled with the naive scrawls of a girl who still thought her parents might love her if she could just be good enough. Ethan's baby blanket, the soft blue one my mother had thrown away because she said it was ratty, and made the house look poor. A handful of birthday cards from friends I'd been forbidden to see because my father decided they were bad influences. Each item was a piece of myself that had been systematically destroyed. I brought everything down to my bedroom and laid it out on the bed like artifacts in a museum. These were the remnants of a life that could have been. The evidence of murder, not of a person, but of potential, of hope, of any chance at normal happiness. Looking at these items spread across my faded comforter, I made a decision. I would document everything. Every wound, every scar, every piece of proof that the life I'd been forced to live was built on violence and control. Not because I planned to show anyone, not yet, but because I needed to remember why when the time came, I would have to be ruthless. I retrieved my phone from its hiding place at the back of my underwear drawer. It was an old iPhone, the screen cracked, that I'd found at a yard sale 3 years ago and paid for with coins I'd been collecting. I'd never told my parents about it. It was my one secret, my lifeline to a world beyond these walls. I used it sparingly, only when they were gone, always careful to clear the history and turn it completely off before hiding it again. Now I used it to photograph everything: the torn acceptance letter, the diary entries where I'd written about bruises and broken ribs, the baby blanket with its faded sheet pattern. I took pictures of my room too, the lock on the outside of the door that my father had installed when I was 13, so he could lock me in as punishment, the window with the bars he'd added when I'd tried to sneak out at 16 to go to a school dance. Then I went to the garage. My father's workshop was immaculate tools hung in precise rows on pegboard, everything labeled and organized. He took more care of his possessions than he'd ever taken of his family. There on the second shelf from the bottom was the tube of industrial adhesive. He'd placed it back carefully like it was just another tool for another job. I photographed it from multiple angles, making sure the brand name was visible. The applicator tip still had dried residue on it. Evidence. The belt hung on a hook by his chair in the living room, leather worn smooth from years of use. Not just on me, but on my mother too, back in the early days before she learned to align herself with his cruelty instead of opposing it. I photographed that too, along with the coffee table that bore a dent from the time he'd slammed my head into it when I was 12. I'd told the school nurse I'd fallen off my bike. She'd believed me because I was a good kid, a quiet kid, and good quiet kids didn't get abused by their parents. In Ethan's room, I photographed the corner where he liked to hide the wallpaper torn at child height from his fingernails scratching at it during panic attacks. I documented the way his bed was pushed against the wall, positioned so he could see the door at all times. The hypervigilance of a child who'd learned that safety was an illusion and danger could come at any moment. By the time I was done, I had over 100 photos. I uploaded them to a cloud storage account I'd set up under a fake name, then deleted them from my phone. The evidence existed now somewhere beyond my father's reach, waiting for whenever I might need it. When my parents came home from church, I was in the kitchen preparing their lunch. Pot roast with potatoes and carrots, my father's favorite. I served it with a smile, my torn lips hidden under a fresh coat of that red lipstick I'd promised to wear. My mother studied me across the table. Her eyes narrowed with something that might have been suspicion or might have been satisfaction. It was hard to tell with her. "That's a good color on you," she said finally. "Very striking. You should wear red more often. It makes you look less washed out." So I did. The next day I added a red scarf. The day after that, red earrings. Each morning I added another piece of red to my outfit, building it layer by layer until I looked like I was dressed for battle. Which in a way I was. My parents thought I was finally learning to take care of my appearance to make myself presentable. They had no idea I was building armor. The red became my war paint, my daily reminder of what I was preparing for. Every time I looked in the mirror and saw that splash of crimson, I remembered the promise I'd made to myself on that living room floor. I wouldn't stay silent forever. This was just the gathering period, the calm before the storm. In the evenings when my parents settled into their routine of television and judgment, I began teaching Ethan what I thought of as survival skills. We played a game where he had to pack a small backpack with essential items as quickly as possible. He thought it was fun, racing against the timer I'd set on the kitchen microwave. "What do we pack, Mom?" he'd ask, his brown eyes bright with the excitement of competition. "Your favorite stuffed animal," I'd tell him. "A change of clothes, the granola bars from your school lunch, your toothbrush, and this." I'd hand him a small photograph of the two of us taken on his last birthday, when I'd managed to scrape together enough money to take him to the park. We looked happy in that photo. Really happy. It was the only picture I had where both of our smiles reached our eyes. Ethan got faster each time we practiced. He didn't ask why we were doing this, and I didn't offer an explanation. He was a smart kid, much smarter than anyone gave him credit for. I think some part of him understood that we were practicing for something important, even if he couldn't articulate what. On the nights when my father's drinking was particularly bad, when I could hear him raging about something that had happened at work or some perceived slight from one of his cronies, I'd take Ethan into his room and we'd practice being quiet. We'd sit on his bed and play the silent game, seeing who could stay perfectly still and soundless for the longest time. I'd time it on my hidden phone, pushing the limit a little longer each night. 5 minutes, 10, 15. Ethan got remarkably good at it, learning to control even his breathing. "Why do we have to be so quiet, Mom?" he whispered one night after we'd finished. I stroked his hair, feeling the softness of it under my fingers. He still had that little kid hair, fine and prone to sticking up at odd angles. "Sometimes," I said carefully, "being quiet keeps us safe. But there's a difference between being quiet because you're afraid and being quiet because you're smart. We're practicing being smart quiet. Does that make sense?" He nodded solemnly. "Like when the rabbits in that book hide from the fox." Exactly like that. What I didn't tell him was that we weren't always going to be the rabbits. Eventually, we were going to find a way to be something else entirely, but that would come later. For now, we practiced patience and preparation. During the day, while my parents were at work and Ethan was at school, I began stockpiling. Small amounts of cash skimmed from the grocery money, $5 or $10 at a time. Nothing large enough to be noticed, but it added up. I'd buy generic brands instead of name brands and pocket the difference. I'd claim items were on sale when they weren't and keep the extra. I'd find change in coat pockets and the couch cushions and the bottom of my mother's purse. Within 3 months, I had $400 hidden in a tampon box under my bathroom sink. My father would never look there. He was the type of man who became uncomfortable at the mere mention of menstruation, who acted like it was some kind of personal failing on the part of women rather than basic biology. I also acquired a burner phone from a convenience store, 3 towns over, paying cash and giving a fake name. It was one of those cheap flip phones that came with prepaid minutes, the kind drug dealers used in movies. I activated it and then powered it down, hiding it in the false bottom of that camping bin in the garage. I didn't need it yet, but I would. When we left, I couldn't risk my parents tracking us through my regular phone. I gathered other essentials too, a photocopy of Ethan's birth certificate that I made at the library while he was at story hour, our social security cards, which I'd been keeping in a box in my closet, a list of women's shelters in cities far from here, addresses and phone numbers, written in code in the back of one of my old cookbooks, a prepaid credit card I'd found in my mother's wallet, half used, but with over $200 still on it. I took it one afternoon while she was in the shower, gambling that she wouldn't notice or would assume she'd misplaced it. Everything went into the false bottom of that camping bin. My escape hatch, my insurance policy, the physical manifestation of hope. The hardest part was maintaining the facade, continuing to play the dutiful daughter while inside I was planning rebellion, smiling when I wanted to scream, serving meals with steady hands when I wanted to flip the table, accepting their criticisms and insults with downcast eyes when I wanted to tell them exactly what I thought of them. But I'd had 29 years of practice at hiding my true feelings. I was an expert at survival through submission. The only difference now was that the submission had an expiration date. The weeks passed in a strange kind of slow-motion suspension. Summer faded into fall, and the leaves on the trees outside began to turn brilliant shades of red and gold. I found myself staring at them, sometimes marveling at how something could be so beautiful in the process of dying. Maybe there was a metaphor there. Maybe the old version of me had to die completely before something new could emerge. My father's behavior grew worse as the months went on. He was under pressure at work, something about a contract that hadn't gone through, and he took it out on everyone around him. My mother became even more withdrawn, spending hours in her room with the door locked. And Ethan, my poor sweet boy, grew quieter and more anxious with each passing day. The final straw came on a Tuesday in October. We'd sat down to dinner, one of those awkward silent affairs, where the only sounds were silverware on plates and the occasional grunt of approval or disapproval from my father. Ethan had been tired coming down with a cold, and his coordination was off. When he reached for his glass of milk, his small hand knocked it over. The glass didn't break, just tipped and spilled, white liquid spreading across the dark wood of the table and dripping onto the floor. A simple accident, the kind of thing that happens with children. But my father's hand shot out like a striking snake and cracked across Ethan's face. The sound echoed in the dining room sharp as a gunshot, and Ethan's head snapped to the side from the force of it. For a moment, there was perfect silence. Then my son's face crumpled, and tears began streaming down his cheeks, though he tried desperately not to make a sound. "Clumsy little weakling," my father snarled. "Just like your mother, can't even hold a glass properly. What kind of man are you going to grow up to be pathetic?" I was on my feet before I'd made a conscious decision to move. "He's 7 years old," I said, my voice shaking with the effort of keeping it level. "It was an accident." My father turned those cold eyes on me, and I saw something flicker there, something that looked almost like pleasure. He liked it when I stood up to him. It gave him an excuse. "An accident," he repeated mockingly. "Everything's always an accident with you two. Maybe if you taught him properly, he wouldn't be such a disappointment." I wanted to say so many things. Wanted to list every way he'd failed as a father and a grandfather and a human being. Wanted to catalog every bruise, every broken promise, every moment of terror he'd inflicted on us. But I'd learned long ago that words only made things worse. So instead, I took Ethan's hand and led him away from the table. "Where do you think you're going?" my father called after us. "We're not done with dinner." "Ethan doesn't feel well," I said without turning around. "He needs to lie down." I half expected my father to follow us to drag us back to the table and make us finish the meal. But he just laughed a harsh sound that followed us up the stairs. "That's right, runaway. That's all you two are good for." In Ethan's room, I cleaned his face with a cool washcloth and checked the red handprint on his cheek. It was already starting to swell. By morning, it would be a bruise. I'd have to keep him home from school, tell them he'd fallen. Another lie in a lifetime of lies. "Does it hurt?" I asked softly. Ethan nodded, fresh tears spilling over. "I didn't mean to spill it, Mom. I was just tired and my hand slipped. I'm sorry." The apology broke something in me. This child, this innocent, beautiful child, was apologizing for being human, for making a simple mistake. "Baby, it's not your fault," I told him, pulling him close. "None of this is your fault. You didn't do anything wrong." "Then why does Grandpa hate me?" The question came out small and broken, and I felt my heart shatter into pieces. "He doesn't hate you." I lied because what else could I say? That his grandfather was a monster, that some people were incapable of love, that the violence had nothing to do with Ethan's worth and everything to do with my father's broken soul. He was too young for those truths. I stayed with Ethan until he fell asleep, stroking his hair and humming lullabies I remembered from when he was a baby. When his breathing finally deepened and evened out, I carefully extracted myself from his bed and returned to my room. I didn't cry. I was beyond tears. Instead, I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark and made a decision. We couldn't wait any longer. Every day we stayed was another day. Ethan learned that love looked like violence, that he deserved to be punished for the crime of existing. If I waited much longer, the damage would be permanent. He'd grow up believing my father's lies, internalizing the cruelty until it became part of his identity. I pulled out the camping bin from the garage and checked its contents. Everything was there. $460 in cash, the burner phone, Ethan's birth certificate and our social security cards, the prepaid credit card, a list of shelters, a change of clothes for both of us, granola bars and bottled water, everything we'd need for the first few days. Tomorrow, I decided. Tomorrow we would leave. That night I barely slept. I lay in bed listening to the house settle to my father's snoring from down the hall to the distant sound of traffic on the highway. I thought about all the times I'd imagined leaving, all the times I'd stood at the bus stop or passed the train station and wondered what would happen if I just kept going. What had always stopped me before was fear. Fear of the unknown, fear of failing, fear that my father was right and I really was too stupid to survive on my own. But that fear had been replaced by something stronger, rage. Not the hot, explosive kind that burns itself out quickly, but cold, calculated rage. The kind that sustains you, the kind that gives you strength when you thought you had none left. When morning finally came, I got up and dressed carefully, jeans and a comfortable sweater, my sneakers instead of the flats I usually wore, practical clothes for traveling. I put on my red lipstick, my armor, and studied my reflection one last time. The woman looking back at me was different from the one I'd been just a few months ago. Harder, more focused, ready. I made breakfast as usual, serving my parents their eggs and coffee with a smile. They didn't notice anything different. Why would they? I'd been playing this role for so long that it had become invisible. I'm taking Ethan to the library, I announced as I cleared the dishes. He has a book report due. My father didn't even look up from his newspaper. Fine, be back by 4. I want dinner on time tonight. My mother waved a dismissive hand. Pick up my prescription while you're out, and don't forget the dry cleaning. Of course, I said, and felt a wild urge to laugh. They had no idea these were the last words they'd ever speak to me. No idea that in a few hours I'd be gone, and they'd have no one left to control. I woke Ethan and helped him dress, keeping my movements calm and normal, even though my heart was racing. We're going on an adventure today, I told him quietly. Remember that backpack we practiced with? I need you to get it ready with your important things. His eyes widened, but he nodded and moved quickly to his closet. He'd gotten good at our drills. Within 5 minutes, his small backpack was loaded with clothes, his favorite stuffed dinosaur granola bars, and that photograph of us from his birthday. We walked out the front door like we did every other day. I'd left a pot roast in the slow cooker set to be ready by 6. My father would think I'd just been delayed. It would be hours before they realized we weren't coming back. The first stop was the bank. I withdrew the $400 I'd hidden in my account, the one my parents didn't know about that. I'd opened years ago with money from a tax return. Then we walked to the bus station on the edge of town. I bought 2 tickets to a city 200 miles away, paying cash and giving a fake name when the clerk asked. The bus didn't leave for another hour, so we waited in the small station cafe. I bought Ethan hot chocolate and a muffin, normal things, while my mind raced with contingency plans. What if someone who knew us saw us? What if my parents called the police? What if this was a huge mistake? But when I looked at my son at the bruise blooming purple on his cheek, I knew it wasn't a mistake. Staying would be the mistake. Staying would kill us, maybe not physically, but in every way that mattered. When our bus finally arrived, I held Ethan's hand tight as we boarded. We found seats near the back, and as the bus pulled away from the station, I watched our town disappear through the dirty window. Everything I'd ever known fell away behind us, good and bad together. I felt like I was floating, untethered, and I couldn't tell if the feeling was terror or freedom. Maybe it was both. Ethan pressed his face to the window, watching the landscape change from familiar to foreign. We passed through small towns I'd never visited, crossed rivers I'd never seen, drove through forests that seemed to go on forever. With each mile, I felt the grip of fear loosen just slightly. "Where are we going, Mom?" Ethan asked after we'd been on the road for about an hour. I looked down at his upturned face, at those trusting brown eyes that still believed I could fix anything. "Somewhere new," I told him. "Somewhere safe." "Will Grandpa and Grandma come visit?" The question was innocent, the hopeful inquiry of a child who didn't yet understand that some relationships were better left broken. "No, baby, this is just for us. A fresh start." He seemed to consider this, then nodded, and returned his attention to the window. He didn't ask any more questions, and I was grateful. I didn't have answers yet. I only had forward momentum and a desperate hope that it would be enough. The bus made several stops along the way, picking up and dropping off passengers. I watched each new person who boarded with paranoid attention, convinced that somehow my father had tracked us down, that he'd sent someone to drag us back. But no one paid us any attention. We were just another mother and child traveling somewhere unremarkable and invisible. By the time we reached the city, it was late afternoon, and the sky was beginning to darken with approaching evening. The bus station was in a rough part of town, surrounded by pawn shops and liquor stores with barred windows. Not the fresh start I'd imagined, but it was a beginning. I'd done research during those secret library visits, had written down addresses and phone numbers in code. Now I pulled out that crumpled piece of paper and studied it. There were 3 women's shelters in the city, but only one that specifically mentioned accepting mothers with children without requiring prior approval. St. Catherine's House, run by Catholic Charities. We took a city bus to the address I'd memorized, traveling through neighborhoods that ranged from rundown to actively dangerous. Ethan stayed close to my side, his small hand gripping mine tightly. He'd never been in a city before, never seen buildings this tall or streets this crowded. I could feel his anxiety radiating off him in waves. St. Catherine's House turned out to be a nondescript brick building in a mixed commercial and residential area. There was no sign announcing what it was, just a street number and a small cross above the door. Security, I realized. Women came here to hide from dangerous situations. Advertising the location would defeat the purpose. I pressed the buzzer and waited, my heart pounding. A woman's voice came through the intercom. "Yes, I need help," I said simply. "Me and my son, we need a place to stay." There was a pause, then the sound of locks disengaging. The door opened to reveal a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She looked us over quickly, her gaze lingering on the bruise on Ethan's face and the carefully concealed damage on my mouth. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. "You're safe here." Those 3 words, simple and direct, nearly broke me. I felt tears prick at the back of my eyes but forced them down. I couldn't afford to fall apart yet. There would be time for that later. The woman introduced herself as Margaret and led us through a hallway to a small office. She offered Ethan juice and crackers, which he accepted shyly, then turned her attention to me. "I need to get some basic information," she said gently. "But I want you to know that whatever you tell me stays confidential. We don't contact family members without your explicit permission, and we don't share information with anyone unless required by law. You understand?" I nodded, relief flooding through me. "My name is Sarah Turner. This is my son Ethan. He's 7. We're from Millbrook, about 200 miles from here. We need somewhere to stay while I figure out what to do next." Margaret wrote this down, then looked up at me with those kind, knowing eyes. "Are you in immediate danger? Is there anyone who might come looking for you here?" "My parents," I said, and the word felt strange in my mouth, like it belonged to someone else's story. "My father is violent. My mother enables him. Last night he hit Ethan for spilling milk. It wasn't the first time. It won't be the last if we go back. And they don't know you're here." "No one knows we're here. I told them we were going to the library. They won't realize we're gone for hours still." Margaret nodded, still writing. "We can provide you with a room for up to 6 weeks while you get on your feet. We'll help you apply for assistance programs, find employment, locate permanent housing. We have childcare services if you need to look for work or attend appointments. And we have a counselor on staff who works with both adults and children who've experienced trauma." She paused, looking at me directly. "Sarah, you did the right thing by leaving. I know it doesn't feel like it right now. I know you're probably terrified and second-guessing every choice. But getting your son out of that situation took tremendous courage." I wanted to believe her, but courage wasn't what I felt. I felt like a thief who'd stolen away in the night, like a coward who'd run instead of fighting like a failure who couldn't even keep her own child safe in his own home. But I nodded anyway, accepting the validation I couldn't quite internalize. Margaret showed us to our room on the 2nd floor. It was small but clean, with 2 single beds, a dresser, and a tiny bathroom. The window looked out onto a parking lot, but it had bars on it. For keeping bad people out, I hoped, not for keeping us in. "Dinner is at 6 in the communal dining room," Margaret told us. "Breakfast at 7, lunch at noon. We have house rules posted in the kitchen. Basic stuff: no alcohol or drugs, no male visitors, quiet hours after 9 p.m. Laundry facilities are in the basement. If you need anything, my office is downstairs, and there's always someone on duty at the front desk." After she left, I sat on one of the beds and pulled Ethan onto my lap. He'd been so quiet, so well-behaved, but I could feel the tension in his small body. "You okay, buddy?" He nodded against my shoulder. "Is this our new home?" "For a little while," I said. "Until we find something better. Think of it like camping, an adventure." "I like adventures," he said, but his voice was small and uncertain. That night we ate dinner in the communal dining room with a dozen other women and children. Everyone had that same haunted look, that same careful way of moving through space, like they were trying not to be noticed. No one asked questions. No one made small talk. We were all there for the same reason, running from the same kind of monsters with different faces. Back in our room, I helped Ethan get ready for bed. As I tucked him in, he looked up at me with those serious eyes. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" It was the same question I'd been asking myself, the one I didn't have a real answer to. But I smiled and kissed his forehead. "Yes, baby, we're going to be okay, I promise." After he fell asleep, I sat by the window and looked out at the city lights. Somewhere out there, 200 miles away, my parents had come home to find us gone. I imagined my father's rage, the way he'd storm through the house looking for clues, the slow dawning realization that we weren't coming back. I imagined my mother's panic, not because she was worried about us, but because she was worried about what people would think. And for the first time in my life, I didn't care what they thought or felt or said. They'd had 29 years to love me, and instead they'd spent that time breaking me down piece by piece. Now they'd have to live with the consequences of their choices. I didn't sleep much that night. Every noise in the hallway made me jump, convinced my father had somehow found us. But morning came without incident, weak sunlight filtering through the barred window, and I realized we'd made it through our first night away. The first week passed in a blur of paperwork and appointments. Margaret helped me apply for emergency assistance for Medicaid for Ethan for food stamps. I registered him at the local elementary school under my maiden name, which I'd legally never changed, even though everyone in Millbrook assumed I was a Turner. Sarah Chen, that was who I'd been before my life became about survival. Maybe that was who I could be again. I found work through a temp agency that Margaret connected me with. Cleaning hotel rooms during the day, the kind of work that didn't require references or background checks. It was hard physical labor, but I didn't mind. It felt good to be tired from work instead of tired from fear. I earned minimum wage, and every penny went into a jar I kept hidden in our room. In the evenings, I worked as a waitress at a diner 3 blocks from the shelter. The tips were decent, and the owner, an older Greek man named Stavros, didn't ask questions when I told him I could only accept cash payment. He'd seen women like me before, I think. Knew we were running from something and needed to stay off the books. Ethan adjusted surprisingly well. His new school was smaller, and the teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, had a gentle way about her that put him at ease. Within a week, he'd made a friend, a boy named Marcus, who lived in our building with his mom. They'd play together in the recreation room after school, while I worked, and I'd see Ethan smile in a way he never had before. Real smiles, not the careful ones he'd learned to produce on command. But my parents didn't let us go quietly. The phone calls started 3 days after we left. I'd been checking my old voicemail remotely, unable to completely cut the cord just yet. Maybe I wanted to hear their panic. Maybe I needed to know they'd noticed we were gone. The first message was from my mother, her voice tight with barely suppressed hysteria. "Where are you? Call me back right now. This isn't funny, Sarah. People are asking questions. You need to come home immediately." The second a few hours later had shifted to anger. "How dare you do this to us? After everything we've done for you, you're being incredibly selfish and immature. Your father is furious. You need to call us back and explain yourself." By the 5th message, she'd moved to manipulation. "I don't understand why you're doing this. We only ever wanted to help you. If you were unhappy, you should have talked to us. We can work this out. Just come home and we'll forget this whole thing happened." I listened to each one with detached fascination, like I was hearing about someone else's life. The desperation in her voice was almost satisfying. For the first time, they couldn't control the narrative. For the first time, I held the power. My father called exactly once 2 weeks after we'd left. His message was brief, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you can run from us, you ungrateful piece of trash. You think you can just take that boy and disappear? You're nothing without us. You'll come crawling back, and when you do, you're going to regret every second of this little stunt." I saved that message, not to torture myself with it, but as a reminder of exactly what I was protecting Ethan from, what I was protecting myself from. But as the weeks turned into a month, the calls became less frequent. My mother left increasingly desperate messages, her carefully constructed facade cracking. "Please, Sarah, people are talking. They think we did something to you. Mrs. Henderson from church asked me directly why you left. What am I supposed to tell people? You're destroying our reputation." There it was, the truth at the heart of everything. She wasn't worried about me or Ethan. She was worried about appearances, about what the neighbors thought, about the gossip at church. Her daughter's safety mattered less than her social standing. I stopped checking the voicemail after that. There was nothing there I needed to hear. Life at the shelter fell into a routine. Work, sleep, spend what little time I had with Ethan, repeat. It wasn't glamorous, but it was ours. No one told me what to wear or how to speak. No one hit my son for childish mistakes. We ate when we were hungry, slept when we were tired, and slowly began to remember what it felt like to simply exist without fear. But I'd be lying if I said it was easy. There were nights when I'd lie awake and wonder if I'd made a terrible mistake. If maybe I should have tried harder to make it work. If maybe I was overreacting like my mother said. The doubts would creep in during those dark hours, whispering that I was weak, that I'd given up that real mothers stayed and endured for their children. Then I'd look at Ethan sleeping peacefully in the bed next to mine, no longer having nightmares every night, no longer flinching at loud noises, and I'd know I'd made the right choice. Some situations couldn't be fixed. Some people couldn't be changed. And staying in a burning building hoping the fire would put itself out was just another form of suicide. 6 weeks into our stay, Margaret called me into her office. "We need to talk about next steps," she said gently. "The shelter has a time limit, as you know. You've been here almost the full 6 weeks. We need to start thinking about permanent housing." The thought filled me with anxiety. The shelter was safe, known. Out there in the real world, I'd be vulnerable again. But I also knew I couldn't hide here forever. What are my options? Margaret pulled out a folder thick with information. There are several transitional housing programs for single mothers, subsidized apartments where you'd pay based on your income. Some have waiting lists, but a few have immediate openings. There's also Section 8 housing vouchers, though those can take months to process. We spent the next hour going through options, filling out applications, making phone calls. By the end of it, I had appointments to view 3 different apartments and paperwork submitted for 4 different assistance programs. You're doing really well, Sarah, Margaret said as I stood to leave. Most women who come through here are still figuring out how to function after years of abuse. But you've hit the ground running. You're working 2 jobs, you've gotten Ethan enrolled in school, you're taking steps toward independence. That takes strength. I wanted to tell her that it didn't feel like strength. That every day I was terrified I'd fail, that I'd prove my father right about being too stupid to survive on my own. That sometimes I still tasted that industrial adhesive in my mouth and felt my lips sealing shut and wondered if I'd ever really escape. But I just smiled and thanked her and went back to our room. The first apartment I viewed was terrible. Roaches in the kitchen, stains on the carpet that looked like dried blood, a broken window patched with cardboard. I left before the landlord finished showing me around. The second was better, but in a neighborhood where gunshots echoed at night and drug deals happened openly on the corner. Not ideal for raising a 7-year-old. The third apartment, though, felt different. It was small, just a 1-bedroom in an older building, but it was clean, and the landlord, an elderly woman named Mrs. Chen, who shared my maiden name, seemed kind. You and the boy can have the bedroom, she told me. I'll sleep on the pull-out couch. The rent is $600 a month, and that includes utilities. I know it's tight quarters, but it's safe here. Good neighborhood, good schools. $600. I did quick math in my head. With my 2 jobs, I was making about $1,500 a month. After rent, that would leave me $900 for food, transportation, clothes, emergencies. It would be tight, but it was doable. I'll take it, I said before I could second-guess myself. Mrs. Chen smiled. When can you move in? Is tomorrow too soon? We moved into our new apartment 3 days later. It wasn't much, just a bedroom and a living room and a tiny kitchen with appliances older than I was, but it was ours. No bars on the windows, no communal living, no time limits. Just a space that belonged to us where we could start building a real life. Ethan explored every inch of it, opening cabinets and closets, testing the locks on the doors, peering out the windows. This is really ours, Mom, just ours. Just ours. I confirmed, feeling something warm bloom in my chest. Pride, maybe, or hope, or just the simple satisfaction of having provided my child with something basic that every child deserved: a safe place to live. That night after Ethan fell asleep in our shared bedroom, I stood at the living room window and looked out at the city. 3 months ago, I'd been trapped in a house that was slowly killing me. Now I was here in a city where no one knew my past, with a job and an apartment and a future that belonged to me. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A text from an unknown number. For a moment, panic seized me. They'd found us. Somehow my parents had tracked us down. But when I opened it, the message was from one of my coworkers at the diner. Hey, Sarah Stavros is asking if you can cover my shift tomorrow. I'll owe you one. Just a normal text. From a normal job. About a normal schedule conflict. The mundane miracle of ordinary life. I texted back, agreeing to the shift, then sat down on our second-hand couch and allowed myself to feel it. Really feel it. The freedom, the possibility, the terrifying, exhilarating knowledge that I was building something new from nothing. But I wasn't naive. I knew my parents wouldn't give up easily. I knew that eventually they'd find ways to try to pull me back into their orbit. People like them didn't let go of control without a fight, so I stayed vigilant. I kept my maiden name on everything official. I didn't post on social media. I paid cash whenever possible to avoid leaving a paper trail. I was friendly but distant with neighbors and coworkers, never sharing too many personal details. Then 3 months after we'd settled into our new life, the first crack appeared. I came home from my evening shift at the diner to find a message from Margaret at the shelter. Sarah, call me as soon as you get this. It's important. My hands shook as I dialed her number. Margaret, it's Sarah. What's wrong? Your mother called here today. Margaret said, her voice tight with concern. I don't know how she found out you'd stayed with us, but she knew. She was demanding to know where you are now, saying she needs to talk to you about a family emergency. My blood ran cold. What did you tell her? Nothing. I told her we don't give out information about our residents, past or present. She got very angry, started making threats about reporting us for harboring a kidnapper, about getting lawyers involved. It was all bluster, but Sarah, you need to be careful. If she found the shelter, she might find your apartment too. I thanked Margaret and hung up, my mind racing. How had she found us? I'd been so careful. Unless... I thought back to those first few weeks, to the paperwork and applications. Some of them had required my real name, my social security number. Could my mother have hired someone to track us through those channels? It seemed extreme, but then again, nothing my parents did should surprise me anymore. I checked every window, made sure every door was locked, then went to check on Ethan. He was sleeping peacefully, his stuffed dinosaur clutched in his arms, completely unaware of the danger circling us. I couldn't go back to that life, wouldn't go back. But I also couldn't spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, waiting for my father's rage to find us. That night, I made a decision. If they wanted to invade my new life, if they wanted to try to drag me back into their world of control and violence, then I would fight back. Not with my fists, not with screaming matches, but with the one thing they valued more than anything else, their reputation. The next day after dropping Ethan at school, I went to the public library and sat down at a computer. I logged into the burner email account I'd set up months ago and navigated to social media sites I hadn't looked at since leaving Millbrook. My mother's accounts were still active, still posting the same curated images of a perfect life. Photos of church socials and charity events. Inspirational quotes about faith and family. Posts praising my father's business acumen and community involvement. To anyone scrolling through, they looked like model citizens. But I knew the truth, and I had proof. I pulled out my phone and opened the cloud storage where I'd uploaded all those photos months ago. The tube of industrial adhesive, the belt, the torn acceptance letter, and most damning of all, the voicemail my father had left. You think you can run from us, you ungrateful piece of trash. I'd been saving these for myself as proof that I wasn't crazy, that what I'd endured was real. But now they could serve another purpose. I didn't upload everything. That would be too much, too desperate. Instead, I created a simple audio file from my father's voicemail, slightly distorted, but clear enough to understand. Then I found my mother's church group Facebook page, the one she was so proud of, where she posted about community service and spiritual growth. The group was public, designed to attract new members. Anyone could see the posts. Anyone could comment. I created a fake account under a generic name, uploaded the audio clip, and posted it to the group with a simple caption, "Even angels have rotting wings when you get close enough." Then I logged out, cleared my browsing history, and left the library. I didn't check social media for 2 days. When I finally did, using a different computer at a different library, the post was gone, deleted, but the damage had been done. There were screenshots circulating, people were talking. The comments before deletion had been a mix of shock and speculation. Is that Robert Turner? Oh my God, that's definitely his voice. I always thought there was something off about that family. My mother's account went quiet after that. No more inspirational posts, no more family photos, just silence. Then the phone calls started again, but different this time. Frantic, desperate. "What have you done?" my mother screamed into my voicemail. "Do you have any idea what you've done to us?" "The church board asked your father to step down from teaching. We've been uninvited from the Harrisons' anniversary party. People crossed the street to avoid us. You've destroyed everything we built." Her voice cracked on the last word, dissolving into something that might have been tears. "How could you do this to your own family? We gave you everything. We raised you, and this is how you repay us." I saved the message, adding it to my collection. Evidence not for a court, but for the moments when doubt crept in, when I questioned if maybe I'd been too harsh, too cruel. These messages reminded me that even now, even after everything, they couldn't see what they'd done wrong. They could only see how they'd been wronged. The next message from my father was shorter but more disturbing. His voice was calm, eerily so. "You've made a very big mistake, Sarah. You think you can humiliate me and get away with it. You think you can make me look like a monster to people who've known me for decades. I will find you. And when I do, you're going to wish you'd never been born." The threat was clear, and for the first time since leaving, I felt genuine fear. Not fear of going back, but fear that he'd come here to this new life I'd built and try to destroy it. I reported the threatening message to the police. They took a statement, but weren't particularly concerned. "It's just a family dispute," the officer told me. "Unless he actually shows up and threatens you in person, there's not much we can do. But you can file for a restraining order if you want." So I did. I filled out the paperwork, included transcripts of the threatening messages, photos of old bruises I'd documented. A hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. In the meantime, I took precautions. I changed Ethan's school route, walking him a different way each day. I varied my work schedule as much as possible. I befriended our neighbor across the hall, an older woman named Maria, who'd survived her own abusive marriage and understood without me having to explain. She agreed to keep an eye out for anyone suspicious hanging around our building. "You're not alone," Maria told me one evening when I'd confided some of my story. "And you're doing the right thing. Men like your father, they think they own you, think they can treat you however they want, and you'll just take it. Standing up to him, that takes real courage." But it didn't feel like courage. It felt like survival, like I was an animal backed into a corner fighting tooth and nail for the lives of me and my cub. The restraining order hearing came on a gray Wednesday in late January. I'd taken the day off work, arranged for Ethan to stay with Maria, and dressed in the most professional clothes I owned. A borrowed suit jacket over a simple dress, my hair pulled back, minimal makeup. I wanted to look credible, stable, not like the hysterical, ungrateful daughter my parents would undoubtedly paint me as. My father showed up with a lawyer, expensive suit, leather briefcase, the kind of person who charged $500 an hour. My father looked smaller than I remembered, older, his face drawn and gray, but his eyes still held that cold calculation. They sat on one side of the courtroom. I sat alone on the other. When it was my turn to speak, I stood and told the judge everything: the physical abuse, the emotional manipulation, the night he sealed my mouth with industrial adhesive, the voicemail threatening me. I spoke clearly without emotion, presenting facts like I was reporting the weather. The judge listened, his face impassive. Then he turned to my father. "Mr. Turner, do you wish to respond?" My father stood, and his lawyer stood with him. "Your Honor, this is a deeply unfortunate situation. My daughter has always been troubled, mentally unstable. She ran away from home with her child, causing us tremendous distress. These allegations are complete fabrications, attempts to justify abandoning her family. I've never laid a hand on her in anger. I'm a respected businessman in my community, a church elder. Ask anyone who knows me." His voice was smooth, reasonable, the voice of a man wrongly accused, and I watched the judge's face, trying to gauge whether he believed my father's performance. "Do you have evidence of these allegations, Ms. Chen?" the judge asked. I handed over my phone, cued to the voicemail. The courtroom fell silent as my father's voice played through the speakers. "You think you can run from us, you ungrateful piece of trash? You think you can just take that boy and disappear? You're nothing without us. You'll come crawling back, and when you do, you're going to regret every second of this little stunt." The judge's expression didn't change, but he nodded slowly. "That does sound threatening, Mr. Turner." "I was upset," my father said quickly. "My daughter had run away with my grandson. I didn't know if they were safe. I spoke in anger, but I never meant actual harm. It's hyperbole, Your Honor, the kind of thing any worried parent might say." The judge considered this, and I felt my hopes sinking. He was going to side with my father, going to dismiss this as a family squabble, going to send us back into danger. But then the judge spoke. "Mr. Turner, the content of that message goes beyond parental concern. It contains clear threats of retribution. Combined with Ms. Chen's testimony about a history of violence, I'm inclined to grant a temporary restraining order. You are to stay at least 500 feet away from Ms. Chen and her son at all times. No contact, direct or indirect. We'll schedule a hearing in 6 months to determine if the order should be made permanent." I felt something release in my chest. Not quite relief, because a piece of paper wouldn't actually stop my father if he decided to come after me, but it was something. Official recognition that I wasn't crazy, that my fear was legitimate. My father's face turned red, his hands clenching into fists. For a moment I thought he might explode right there in the courtroom. But his lawyer put a hand on his arm, whispered something, and my father forced himself to nod stiffly at the judge. As we filed out of the courtroom, my father passed close enough that I could smell his cologne, the same scent that had haunted my childhood. He leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "This isn't over." Then he was gone, and I was left standing in the fluorescent-lit hallway, shaking with adrenaline and something that might have been victory. That evening, after I had picked Ethan up from Maria's and fed him dinner and tucked him into bed, I did something I'd been avoiding for months. I looked up news from Millbrook online. What I found made me catch my breath. A small article from the local paper dated 3 days ago: local construction company under investigation for fraud. The piece detailed allegations that Turner Construction had been using substandard materials on municipal contracts, pocketing the difference and falsifying inspection reports. An anonymous tip had prompted an audit, and now the state attorney general's office was involved. Another article from the church newsletter, Leadership Changes at First Baptist. Eleanor Turner had stepped down from her position on the board of directors, citing personal reasons and a need to focus on family matters. A third piece from the town's gossip blog, Millbrook's Perfect Couple, Not So Perfect After All. This one didn't name names but described a prominent local family dealing with scandals involving domestic issues and business impropriety. The comments section was full of speculation and not-so-blind items. Everyone knew exactly who they were talking about. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen. I hadn't tipped off the Attorney General, hadn't contacted the church board, hadn't fed information to the gossip bloggers. But I'd lit the match by exposing that one voicemail, and apparently it had been enough to make people start looking closer at the Turner family's perfect facade. Once one crack appeared, the whole structure began to crumble. Part of me felt guilty. These were still my parents after all. The people who'd raised me, fed me, kept a roof over my head. Didn't I owe them something for that? But then I remembered Ethan's bruised face, remembered my mouth sealed shut with industrial adhesive, remembered 29 years of being told I was worthless, stupid, a disappointment. And the guilt evaporated. They'd made their choices, built their lives on a foundation of cruelty and control. Now that foundation was cracking, and they had no one to blame but themselves. Over the next few weeks, I fell into a new routine: work, eat, and sleep, repeat. But it felt different now, lighter, like I'd been carrying a weight I hadn't even realized was there, and suddenly it was gone. Ethan was thriving. His teacher called to tell me he'd been selected for the gifted program, that his reading level was years ahead of his grade. He'd made friends, real friends, and got invited to birthday parties and playdates. He laughed more, played more, stopped having nightmares. One evening, he came home from school with a piece of paper clutched in his hands. "Mom, look what I made in art class." It was a drawing done in crayon and marker with the enthusiastic imprecision of a 7-year-old. 2 stick figures holding hands under a blue sky standing in front of a simple building. At the bottom, in his careful printing, "Our new home, no screaming here." My vision blurred with tears. I pulled him close and kissed the top of his head, breathing in the scent of child shampoo and playground dirt. "It's beautiful, baby. It's so beautiful." "Can we hang it on the fridge?" he asked hopefully. "Absolutely." I taped it up right in the center where we'd see it every day, a reminder of how far we'd come, of why we'd left, of what we were building. That night after Ethan fell asleep, I stood at our apartment window and looked out at the city lights. Somewhere 200 miles away, my parents sat in their silent house full of trophies and framed smiles and photographs of a family that had never really existed. They'd built their world on control, on making me small enough to fit in the box they'd designed. And now they had nothing left to command. For the first time in 29 years, I felt something close to peace. Not revenge, though, that had played its part. Not justice, because the law would never touch what they'd done to me. Just peace. The quiet, solid knowledge that I was free. I whispered into the empty room, my voice barely a breath. "You sealed my mouth once. Now I don't need to speak at all." Outside, the city hummed its gentle chaos, and I thought maybe it had been waiting for me all along. A few days later, I came across a small news item on the local website from my hometown. The headline caught my eye: "Local businessman under investigation for financial fraud." I clicked through and felt my breath catch. It was my father. Apparently, his construction company had been cutting corners on municipal contracts, using substandard materials, and pocketing the difference. Someone had tipped off the authorities. The article went on to mention that Robert Turner's reputation in the community had been recently tarnished by personal scandals, and that his wife Eleanor had stepped down from her position on the church board to focus on family matters. I sat back in my chair, coffee cup warm in my hands, and watched Ethan through the doorway of his room. He was building something with blocks humming tunelessly, at peace, in a way he'd never been in that house. I took a sip of my coffee and smiled. This was just the beginning. They'd spent decades building a perfect facade while the foundation rotted beneath. Now everyone could see the cracks, and there was no amount of paint or polish that could hide what they really were. My phone buzzed. Another voicemail from a number I didn't recognize, probably one of them trying a different approach. I deleted it without listening. Ethan called out, "Mom, come see what I made." I closed my laptop and went to see my son's creation, leaving behind the ashes of the people who'd tried to make me small. They were someone else's problem now. Mine was figuring out what to build with all this new space, all this air I could finally breathe. The scars on my lips had healed, leaving faint white lines that caught the light sometimes. I didn't try to hide them. They were proof, not of what had been done to me, but of the fact that I'd survived it. That I'd taken the worst they could give and turned it into fuel for something better. That night after Ethan fell asleep, I stood at the mirror and looked at my reflection. Really looked. The woman staring back wasn't broken anymore. She was scarred, yes, tired definitely, but her eyes were clear and her shoulders were straight, and when she smiled, it reached all the way up. I touched the faint marks on my lips, the permanent reminder of the night my father tried to silence me forever. "Thank you," I whispered to my reflection, because those scars had taught me something invaluable. When someone tries to steal your voice, you don't need to scream to take it back. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is walk away and build something they can never touch. I turned off the bathroom light and checked on Ethan one more time, watching his chest rise and fall in peaceful sleep. Tomorrow we'd wake up in our little apartment that smelled like vanilla and safety. We'd have breakfast without fear. We'd go about our day without walking on eggshells. We'd live. And somewhere far away in a house that had never been a home, two people would sit in the ruins of their carefully constructed lives and wonder how it all fell apart. They'd probably never understand. People like that rarely do. But I understood. I understood that love isn't supposed to leave scars, that family isn't supposed to make you afraid, that no one, no matter how much DNA you share, has the right to treat you like you're worthless. I understood that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is save yourself. And I understood finally that I deserved to be saved. The city lights glowed outside my window, and for the first time in my entire life, I felt like I belonged to myself. No one could take that away. Not anymore.